A loving father sells his kidney on the black market to pay for his daughter's cancer treatment. A desperate mother abandons her newborn at a hospital because she can't afford to feed another mouth. A respected businessman embezzles money from his own company to cover gambling debts that could destroy his family. These aren't monsters. These aren't evil people. These are human beings pushed to their absolute breaking point. Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of desperation, why good people make choices they never thought they'd make, and what this reveals about human nature itself. If you think you're immune to this, think again. By the end of this video, you'll understand that we're all just a few bad breaks away from facing impossible decisions. The psychology of desperation. Let's start with a fundamental truth. Desperation doesn't just cloud judgment, it rewrites it entirely. When psychologists study decision-making under extreme stress, they discover something disturbing. The rational, moral compass we pride ourselves on, it's more fragile than we want to admit. Dr. Maslow called it the hierarchy of needs, and it's brutal in its simplicity. When your basic survival is threatened, food, shelter, safety, the survival of your loved ones, everything else becomes negotiable. And I mean everything. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for moral reasoning and long-term thinking, literally goes offline when you're in survival mode. Your brain floods with cortisol and adrenaline. You're not thinking about consequences 3 months from now. You're thinking about making it through tonight. This isn't weakness. This is evolutionary programming. For thousands of years, humans who couldn't make hard choices in desperate times didn't survive to pass on their genes. We're the descendants of people who did whatever it took. But here's what makes modern desperation so dangerous. We live in a complex society where desperate choices have complex consequences. A caveman stealing food might face a fight. A modern person stealing might face years in prison, destroyed relationships, and a criminal record that follows them forever. Real examples of desperate choices. Let me share some real examples that'll make you question everything you think you know about right and wrong. The kidney father. In 2012, a Chinese man named Wang Shangkun sold his kidney for $3,500 to buy an iPad and iPhone. But that's not the story I want to tell. I want to tell you about the thousands of fathers in developing countries who sell organs to pay for their children's medical bills. They know the risks. They know it might kill them. But watching your child die when you have something, anything, you can sell, that choice becomes simple. The insurance fraud mother. Sarah Jenkins, a single mother in Ohio, set fire to her own house to claim insurance money. Her daughter needed surgery they couldn't afford. Insurance would have covered it, but only after the procedure. And the hospital required payment up front. She thought she could make it look like an electrical fire. She thought no one would get hurt. She was wrong on both counts. But for 30 seconds, holding that lighter, it seemed like the only way to save her daughter's life. The Ponzi scheme pastor. Pastor Michael Thompson ran a Ponzi scheme that defrauded his congregation of over $2 million. But it didn't start as fraud. It started when the church was facing foreclosure and he borrowed from the building fund, planning to pay it back. One desperate choice led to another, each one seemingly justified by the previous one, until he was in so deep that continuing the lie seemed easier than confessing. The academic fraud. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a respected researcher, fabricated data in her cancer research. Why? Her funding was being cut, her team was being dissolved, and she was 6 months away from a breakthrough that could save lives. In her mind, fudging the numbers to keep the research alive wasn't fraud. It was buying time to prove she was right. She wasn't thinking about scientific integrity. She was thinking about the cancer patients who might die while she fought for more funding. These aren't excuses. These are explanations. There's a difference. The slippery slope of moral compromise. Here's what's terrifying about desperation. It doesn't usually ask you to jump off a moral cliff. It asks you to take one step down a gentle slope. You don't wake up one morning and decide to become a criminal. You wake up and face an impossible situation with no good options. So you tell yourself you'll make one small compromise. Just this once. Just until things get better. But here's the psychological trap. Every moral compromise makes the next one easier. Psychologists call this moral licensing. Once you've done something questionable for a good reason, your brain gives you permission to do worse things later. The pastor didn't set out to steal $2 million. He set out to borrow $5,000. But when $5,000 wasn't enough, $10,000 seemed reasonable. When $10,000 wasn't enough, $50,000 seemed necessary. By the time he was stealing hundreds of thousands, his moral baseline had shifted so far that massive theft felt like a logical next step. This is why desperate people often make choices that seem completely disproportionate to their situation. They're not making one big decision. They're making a series of small decisions, each one slightly worse than the last, until they're somewhere they never imagined they'd be. And here's the kicker. They often still see themselves as good people making hard choices, because in their mind, they're not criminals. They're problem solvers dealing with impossible circumstances. But individual psychology only tells part of the story. Some of the most unthinkable choices people make are amplified by the society we've built. Financial desperation in a debt-based economy. We live in a system where one medical emergency, one job loss, one economic downturn can destroy decades of responsible financial planning. When your choice is bankruptcy or fraud, when it's homelessness or crime, when it's watching your family suffer or doing something illegal, these aren't really choices at all. Social media and the pressure to appear successful. Never before in human history have people been so constantly confronted with everyone else's highlight reel. The pressure to maintain appearances, to keep up with an impossible standard, drives people to make desperate financial choices. Credit card fraud, elaborate lies, fake business schemes, all to maintain an image that was probably fake to begin with. The isolation factor. Desperate people often feel completely alone. They don't see options because they don't have support systems. They don't ask for help because they're ashamed. They don't reach out because they think no one will understand. Isolation makes desperate choices seem like the only choices. Systemic failures. Sometimes desperate choices are the predictable result of systems that fail people. When healthcare is unaffordable, people make desperate choices about medicine. When education is inaccessible, people make desperate choices about their children's futures. When legal immigration is nearly impossible, people make desperate choices about borders. I'm not saying the system justifies everything. I'm saying that if you create conditions where desperate choices are common, you're going to get desperate choices. The neuroscience of desperate decision-making. Let's get scientific for a moment because understanding the neuroscience of desperation explains a lot about why smart, moral people make seemingly irrational choices. When you're under extreme stress, financial pressure, threat to family, time pressure, your brain literally changes how it processes information. Your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, floods your system with stress hormones. This isn't subtle. This is your brain screaming emergency and shutting down non-essential functions. Long-term planning? non-essential. Complex moral reasoning, non-essential. Considering all options, non-essential. Desperate people develop what psychologists call cognitive tunneling. They become hyper-focused on solving the immediate problem and literally cannot see other options. It's not that they choose to ignore better alternatives. Their brain filters them out entirely. Under extreme stress, people lose the ability to accurately assess time and probability. A 10% chance of success feels like 90%. A solution that might work in 6 months feels impossible because they can't think past next week. The scarcity mindset. When resources are limited, your brain shifts into scarcity mode. This makes you more impulsive, more likely to take risks, and more likely to focus on immediate gains rather than long-term consequences. It's the same mental state that makes people fight over toilet paper during a pandemic. This isn't an excuse, it's an explanation. Understanding why your brain works this way is the first step in making better choices when you're under pressure. Let me tell you about James Morrison. 43 years old, married with 2 kids, treasurer of his local church, never had so much as a parking ticket. By all accounts, a pillar of his community. Over 3 years, James embezzled $847,000 from the nonprofit organization where he worked as financial director. How does this happen? It started small. James's wife was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Their insurance covered treatment, but not the experimental therapy that might slow the disease's progress. That therapy cost $3,000 a month. James borrowed $3,000 from petty cash, fully intending to pay it back from his next bonus. But his bonus was smaller than expected, so he borrowed another $3,000, planning to pay back $6,000 from the following quarter's bonus. But his wife's condition worsened. She needed a wheelchair-accessible van, home modifications, special equipment. Each expense seemed like a life-or-death decision, and James had access to money that he told himself he was just borrowing. By year 2, James was taking $15,000 a month. By year 3, he was falsifying records, creating fake vendors, and manipulating financial reports. He wasn't thinking about prison. He wasn't thinking about destroying his career. He was thinking about his wife's next doctor's appointment. When James was finally caught, he broke down completely. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. "I just wanted to help my wife." The tragedy? There were other options. Medical payment plans, charity programs, fundraising campaigns. But James couldn't see them because his brain was in crisis mode, focused only on the immediate problem and the immediate solution. James lost everything: his job, his reputation, his freedom, and the money he stole. It could have been replaced by insurance and payment plans he never explored. The children and desperation. The most heartbreaking, desperate choices involve children. Both choices made by children and choices made for children. When children make desperate choices. A 14-year-old steals food because there's nothing at home and their parent is passed out from drugs again. A 16-year-old joins a gang because it's the only protection available in their neighborhood. A 12-year-old lies about abuse because they're afraid of being separated from siblings in foster care. These children aren't criminals. They're survivors making the best choices they can with the information and options they have. A mother sells drugs because it's the only way to pay rent and keep custody of her children. A father works for a loan shark because legitimate jobs don't pay enough to feed his family. Parents forge documents to get their children into better schools because the local school is dangerous and failing. The parent-child bond is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. When that bond is threatened, when a child's welfare is at stake, parents will do things that would be unthinkable in any other context. Some of the most desperate choices parents make are attempts to avoid losing their children to the system. A parent might hide homelessness, conceal mental illness, or avoid seeking help for addiction because they're terrified of child protective services. Ironically, these choices often make things worse for everyone involved. The system designed to protect children sometimes forces parents into desperate situations where they feel they have to choose between honesty and keeping their family together. Let me be crystal clear about something. Understanding why people make desperate choices is not the same as excusing them. When I explain the psychology behind a father selling drugs to pay for his child's medicine, I'm not saying drug dealing is okay. When I describe why someone commits fraud to save their home, I'm not saying fraud is justified. Understanding is about comprehension. Excusing is about moral absolution. They're completely different things. Why understanding matters. If we don't understand why people make desperate choices, we can't prevent them. If we just write off desperate people as criminals or moral failures, we miss opportunities to address the underlying conditions that create desperation in the first place. If we understand that medical bankruptcy drives people to fraud, we can work on healthcare reform. If we understand that educational inequality drives parents to desperate measures, we can work on school funding. If we understand that social isolation amplifies desperation, we can work on community support systems. The judgment trap. It's easy to judge desperate choices when you've never been desperate. It's easy to say, I would never do that, when you've never faced impossible circumstances with impossible stakes. But research shows that most people wildly overestimate their own moral consistency under pressure. Studies reveal that ordinary people will do extraordinary things, both good and bad, when circumstances are extreme enough. This doesn't mean we lower our standards. This means we raise our empathy and our commitment to creating systems that don't force people into desperate situations in the first place. Desperate choices don't happen in isolation. They create ripple effects that extend far beyond the person making the choice. Family destruction. When someone makes a desperate choice that goes wrong, it doesn't just affect them. The embezzler's children lose their college funds and their father. The insurance fraudster's family loses their home and their sense of security. The academic fraudster's research team loses their careers and their trust in the scientific process. Community impact. Desperate choices often victimize entire communities. The church treasurer who embezzles destroys trust and damages programs that help people. The small business owner who commits fraud might destroy jobs and relationships built over decades. Systemic erosion. When desperate choices become common, they erode the social trust that holds communities together. If everyone assumes their neighbor might be desperate enough to steal, to lie, to cheat, if everyone assumes the system is rigged and desperate measures are normal, then cooperation becomes harder and society becomes more fragmented. The cycle continues. Perhaps most tragically, desperate choices often create the conditions for more desperate choices. The child who grows up watching a parent make desperate choices learns that this is how you solve problems. The community that's been victimized by desperate people becomes less willing to help others in desperate situations. Breaking the cycle. But here's the thing, understanding this cycle gives us power to break it. When we address root causes instead of just punishing symptoms, when we create safety nets instead of just bigger prisons, when we build communities instead of just individual success stories, we reduce the conditions that create desperation in the first place. What this means for you. So what does all this mean for you watching this video? First, build your safety net before you need it. Don't wait until you're desperate to think about what you'd do in a crisis. Build relationships, create emergency funds, understand your options, and know where you'd turn for help. The best time to prepare for desperation is when you're not desperate. Second, recognize the warning signs. If you find yourself thinking, "I'll just do this once," or "this is different," or "I don't have a choice," stop. These are the thoughts that precede desperate choices. When you catch yourself in this mental state, reach out for help, get a second opinion, or at least sleep on the decision. Third, understand your own moral flexibility. You probably have more moral flexibility than you think you do. That's not a criticism, it's human nature. But knowing this about yourself can help you make better choices when you're under pressure. Set hard boundaries before you're in crisis when your judgment is clear. Fourth, create systems, not just individual solutions. If you're in a position of power, as a manager, community leader, parent, or policymaker, think about systems that prevent desperation rather than just punishing desperate choices. Can you create payment plans instead of requiring lump sums? Can you provide support before people reach crisis points? Can you remove barriers that force people into impossible situations? Fifth, practice radical empathy. The next time you hear about someone making a choice that seems unthinkable, ask yourself, what circumstances would push me to consider something similar? This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean understanding that most people making desperate choices aren't monsters. They're humans in impossible situations. The broader implications. Here's what studying desperate choices teaches us about human nature itself. The distance between respectable citizen and desperate criminal is often just a few bad breaks, a few wrong turns, a few impossible circumstances. This should humble us and make us more committed to creating systems that don't push people to their breaking points. This doesn't mean morality is relative or that anything goes. It means that moral reasoning is affected by circumstances, stress, and available options. Good people can make terrible choices when they're pushed far enough. Once someone has made a desperate choice, punishment might be necessary, but it's often too late to prevent the harm. Real solutions focus on addressing the conditions that create desperation in the first place. Isolated people make more desperate choices. Connected people have more options and more support. Building strong communities isn't just nice. It's a practical strategy for reducing desperate behavior. Individual responsibility matters, but so do the systems we create. If our systems regularly push people into desperate situations, we shouldn't be surprised when people make desperate choices. Let me leave you with this thought. Every person you've ever judged for making a desperate choice was once someone just like you. They had dreams, values, people they loved. They probably never imagined they'd find themselves in the situation that led to their desperate choice. This isn't about lowering standards or excusing harmful behavior. This is about understanding that human beings are complex, circumstances matter, and systems have consequences. The father who sold his kidney, the mother who committed insurance fraud, the pastor who ran a Ponzi scheme, the researcher who faked data, they're not villains in a simple story. They're humans